Now, I mentioned these people that are found in the peat bogs. This is a picture of them. These pictures are all over the internet. It's quite fascinating looking at these pictures. And I just say here, the patient says that I was sure after joining the iron blog that I had hemochromatosis, but my genetic test was normal. My ferritin test seems to be very abnormal. I want to have those other genetic tests for ferroportin, hepcidin, hemojuvelin. My doctor doesn't seem to know anything about this topic. Well, I get this question a lot by email or people phoning me because I'm running those tests as a research test in London, Ontario. One of the problems is who's paying for this test. These are, now we're doing a panel of 15 other iron genes in this genetic panel. And the cost of every test is $800. And the government says they're not paying for it. Well, why does the government say they're not paying for it? Well, the prevalence of these diseases is so rare. Like some of these diseases are 1 in 2 million. So if you're a betting person on horses or gambling or whatever, the house is stacked against you that you're going to be positive on this blood test. Now you could say, well, I've got a high ferritin, it's going to be a little bit higher than 1 in 2 million. But some of these things, like ferroportin, we've been running this test for 5 years. We've never seen a case. So these are not very common at all. And given the fact that these are so rare, why should your doctor know anything about it? I mean, this is presumably a general physician, a family doctor. These people are the heroes of the medical system. They have to know a little bit about everything. They're taking care of your kids and your grandparents, and they're busy and they're rushed and they're getting their pay cut all the time and so on. So don't be too hard on these people. And I really don't think that they have to know about all these specialized tests. This is a research test. And it's funny that the people who are most fanatic about this are the people that have the lowest ferritins. So I get these people calling me, they say, my ferritin's really sky high. And I say, well, how high is it? They say, oh, it's 301. I said, well, we had somebody here this week that was 100,000. They have no idea what's out there. 301 is like one toe over the line. So in general, the higher your ferritin is, the more likely you are to have iron overload. But when your ferritin is super high, like 100,000, you usually have another type of disease. That it could be like a blood cancer. There's a condition called histiocytosis that's a bit like that. There's another mystery disease called Still's disease. It's an inflammatory disease, and people sometimes have ferritins of 50,000. So I sometimes say to these people on the phone, if you're so worked up about this, you'd be willing to pay $800 to have this test done. And they say, no, I'm not doing that. So that's usually the way it ends. Now, we have applied again to the Ontario government to have these tests available for selected patients across Canada at no charge. They have rejected this twice. We're on our second appeal. And the guy who's running the test seems to think that we're making some slow progress. So I mentioned that obesity is the #1 factor in most people's elevation in ferritin. And as a person loses weight, and they have to lose a lot of weight, like 100 pounds or so, the ferritin will usually come down towards normal. I also mentioned alcohol, and the effect of iron in alcohol used to be one of the biggest diagnostic problems we had because we couldn't separate them in the clinic. But now, with the genetic test, it's very simple to separate the effects of alcohol from genetic hemochromatosis. Anybody know where this beer is made? Come on, there's some beer experts here. Okay, it's from Western Australia. Okay, so what do these people have who have high ferritin that don't have the typical genetic test? This is a study from quite a while ago, And we did 363 liver biopsies. That's a lot of liver biopsies. And this is not every patient's favorite test. This is a big needle into the side. And what did we find? Well, the HH is our classic hemochromatosis. And 1/3 of the patients who had ferritins between 300 and 1,000 had that. But the other ones, like NAFLD, that's fatty liver, ETOH is alcohol, uncertain, hepatitis C is a small uptick. There's 2% of people with secondary iron overload. That's things like thalassemia. And you can see that almost all of these other cases don't really have iron overload. And getting back to these other rare genes that we're talking about, this was a review done by one of my friends in Australia of these cases, and he could only find 156 patients in the whole world with these diseases. So that's not very many. And some people think there's a total of 12 families that make up these whole story. And that's it. So that's why we keep striking out when we run this genetic test that's 1 in 2 million. Okay, so getting back to that scenario, should your doctor be expected to be an expert in cutting-edge genetics of hemochromatosis and iron overload? The answer is no. Well, what kind of doctor can I find who can help me? I get asked this all the time. If your doctor doesn't seem to know anything about it, it would be a good sign if the doctor admits that to you. Says, look, you know, I'm an old guy and I've been in practice for a long time and they didn't really teach me that in medical school. I've heard of it. I can't spell it, but I just don't know much about it. So I'm going to set you up with one of the young doctors at the university hospital. That's what you want to hear. You don't take it personal that the doctor doesn't seem to be an expert in hemochromatosis. He might be really good at something else. And the fact that he's willing to tell you that he doesn't know that much about it, that's a good thing, I think. The worst scenario is when doctors make mistakes of commission rather than omission. Like the doctor that I told you about earlier that told the woman who was just diagnosed with the genetic test that it doesn't occur in women and that there's no genetic test. That's a troublesome behavior in a doctor. So I'm going to show you a slide in a minute about what kind of doctors you can go to. And there are lots of different kinds of doctors that take care of hemochromatosis. I mentioned to you that non-HFE iron overload is very rare. And these environmental causes are more common, like the metabolic syndrome, daily alcohol, and obesity. And I posed the question to you, would you be interested in paying for a genetic test that has 1 in 2 million chance of being positive? And what if it was positive? Would you feel better? Would you feel that was helpful? It might give you an opportunity to see how your health would compare to a small number of people that have been reported who also have the same genetic test positive. That's why we name diseases, so you can sort of follow patterns. If you were going to get involved in a family study, you'd know which gene to test for if you were testing a big family. So that's another reason why you might want to consider a positive genetic test. Now, if you're sort of stewing about this kind of thing right now, it would be very helpful to your doctors if you said, oh, my brother has this. My brother has iron overload. He went to the Mayo Clinic and he had a liver biopsy. When you hear that, you're on to something. But most people don't have that story. And maybe the story's there, they haven't uncovered it. But that kind of information is a lot more informative. And so you should explore your family history if you think that you have one of these diseases. Okay, what kind of doctors treat hemochromatosis? I'm a gastroenterologist. I'm a liver specialist. That's one of the common groups of doctors that treat hemochromatosis. The other big group is hematology. Those are blood doctors. And anybody on this list is an acceptable thing, I think. Internal medicine, gastroenterology and hematology are part of internal medicine. There are genetics doctors that specialize in genetics. These people started in pediatric clinics, but they're expanding to adult clinics now. There are some pediatricians that are involved with hemochromatosis, not very many. Blood bank doctors, some of them are involved. You should keep in mind that these people don't want to take care of hemochromatosis. And this is a frustration to a lot of patients. People like Marie fought very hard to get the rules changed in Canada in 1991 to make it easier for hemochromatosis patients to be voluntary blood donors. But when they got there, they found that nobody wanted to follow them. Nobody wanted to measure anything. They're not in charge of the treatment of the patient. They're just doing the service of taking the blood off, and they're using it for somebody else. More and more often, care is being done by nurse practitioners, physician assistants. There's nothing wrong with that. In a situation where the same thing is being done over and over again, like the patient comes in, you do the genetic test, you follow up the genetic test, you arrange the phlebotomy, and you do that over and over again, you get quite good at it. I put natural healers here just because somebody might ask about that. I'm not super enthusiastic about that, but I'm not dead against it either. I've had a lot of alternative experiences myself. I've worked in Shanghai and saw a lot of acupuncture. I've worked in the Himalayas and made house visits in these, high altitude sort of mud hut places. I've done work in South America and seen some of these shamans, with the spirits and all this kind of stuff. I worked at San Francisco General Hospital, where they specialize in all of these alternative therapies, but they charge the patient. They charge them a lot in San Francisco for these types of things. So I'd be a bit cautious about spending your money on something like that. And what I don't like in general about this approach is they don't seem to think they need any proof of their products. And that's where we usually differ with them. And some of the products that they're promoting are hazardous. Like some of them promote chelators. Those are bad drugs. These are drugs with lots of toxicity. So where do you find the right doctor? Well, I think you want to go to the nearest city with a medical school near you. So if you're in the Yukon, somebody was mentioning that on the way in, that's not so good for that. I think in most of the other provinces, you know where it is. It's the big city with the medical school. And you want to go see a specialist there that takes care of hemochromatosis. And no, they're not going to be somebody that is doing research and has published lots of papers about it, because there are no people like that anymore. I'm one of a dying breed. I'm a dinosaur in this area, and I'm retiring this year. And there's nobody in my department who's taking this on after I go. And it's a problem. It's not just a problem in hemochromatosis. There's been a move away from young doctors wanting to do research, partly because you make more money doing things to people like colonoscopy and things like that. Don't expect a hemochromatosis specialist. They're becoming extinct. And, some of you people have driven like from Saskatchewan to come to my clinic. That's flattering in some ways. It's, I wouldn't recommend it. It's a long drive, and I have a busy clinic, and when somebody drives all that way, they want to talk to you for more than 10 minutes, sort of thing. So it creates some stresses in the clinic too. And we sometimes get people from Toronto who are coming to London. When I see that, that's trouble, because it means that they've sort of burned through all the doctors in Toronto, and they've come down to London because they're sort of disgruntled. And anyway, that's what happens. Okay, my doctor arranged for weekly phlebotomy at a clinic. I never saw him again. When I went back to talk to another doctor, they told me I don't need any more phlebotomy since my ferritin is normal. I wanted to have phlebotomy until my serum ferritin was 20. 20 is a very low number. And this is another thing that the patients are always asking about. Like, I want to be down at 50. I want to be at 20. I want to be lower. Where do these numbers come from? Well, these numbers were just made up. these numbers like 50 were made up because in the old days, they thought that they would get the iron stores down to low normal, and then the patient would be sort of released from medical treatment. But they thought that most people would be slowly building up iron again, and that this would allow their body iron stores to go from low normal through normal to slightly high, in which case they might come into contact again and they could be treated again. So that's why they chose 50. Now, in the 1970s, when I was working with Dr. Leslie Dahlberg, we used to do liver biopsies on people who had a normal ferritin with hemochromatosis because people were asking questions about, well, what if my transferrin saturation is elevated and my ferritin's normal? Am I getting damage to my liver? So we did liver biopsies. We never saw a case with any abnormalities whatsoever. So if your ferritin's normal, you don't have iron overload in general. You can find a real odd case somewhere, but that's not the usual story. When the AIR study started, the goal of the treatment in the study was going to be 50. We were going to bleed people to 50. One of the American Hemochromatosis societies got really worked up about it and said, no, we want it to be 20 because we want this to be really low. So for the first time at my medical center, we took people from 50 down to 20. And I can tell you, our nurses hated it. There was so much complaining by the patients, and people were fainting and pains, and they didn't want to get out of the chair and all this kind of stuff. So it was not an easy situation for us at all. And as soon as the study was over, we went back to 50. But what about this question of whether the iron is going to reaccumulate again? We thought it would because you're born with this disease. We thought it would be accumulating all the time. So most patients will have an elevated transferrin saturation for most of their life, even with phlebotomy. And I told you that it jumps around day to day. So you can have a low TS at the end of your last phlebotomy, and then it will be up again 5 days later. So you can never really chase this very well. And if you do push to reduce the TS, you're on the brink of anemia. And that will require a lot of monitoring and can have adverse side effects to be anemic like that, like heart disease, shortness of breath, and so on. And the doctors aren't really prepared or in a position to do that degree of monitoring. Keep in mind, and a lot of patients don't know this, that the doctors are not making a penny on doing phlebotomy. I get paid $0 for arranging phlebotomy on a hemochromatosis patient, and they come for 20 years. And I'm not getting a cent unless I see the patient, which is not what happens when they have every phlebotomy. That's different than colonoscopy or starting a patient on dialysis or whatever. Sometimes I get this question about NTBI. I'm hoping nobody is interested in that because I'm not very interested in that. Pierre Brissot is interested in that, but nobody has died from NTBI, non-transferrin bound iron. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about does iron reaccumulate? These are people with hemochromatosis who were bled down to a ferritin of 50, and then we just cut them loose. We didn't completely cut them loose, we monitored them, but we didn't do any maintenance phlebotomy. So these are their ferritins. You can see there, some of these people are up to 10 years. And the dotted lines are the upper range of normal in females and males. But all these people didn't really accumulate iron very much at all. So this led us to stop doing routine maintenance. And now what we do is when we finish phlebotomy, we'll give them a 6-month break and we'll measure the ferritin at 6 months. And we can predict by that change in the ferritin whether they're going to require maintenance. It's like looking at the slope of one of these lines. But you can predict whether you're going to need maintenance very well by what your presenting serum ferritin is. If you're somebody that was diagnosed at age 50 with a ferritin of 500, you're not going to need maintenance. If your ferritin was 5,000, you probably are going to need maintenance. And men need maintenance much more commonly than women. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Now here's a big issue, diet. And the patients love talking about this. And again, we felt this was a knowledge gap in hemochromatosis. So let's try to study the effect of diet on iron and ferritin and hemochromatosis. So we had so much money from the NIH that they gave us their top nutrition team. These were people that had created these standardized questionnaires about diet. And these are 40-page questionnaires. Can you imagine filling out a questionnaire that has 40 pages of what you ate in the last few weeks? And then it's broken down to how much iron was in that food, what type of iron it was, heme iron, non-heme iron, very, very detailed analysis. And the end result, it was shown here, that there was no relationship between serum ferritin and the iron content of the food. So this led us to recommend almost no dietary restrictions in hemochromatosis. Now this goes, a lot of the patients don't like this. They want to be on a very restricted diet. Some of these people come to me, they're on the Hare Krishna diet, they're on this, they're on that, they don't want to eat meat. It doesn't make that much difference. All the food that has supplemental iron added to it, like milk and Kellogg's Corn Flakes and so on, that's a form of iron that's not absorbed. So it's just a commercial that was done in the 1950s to tell you that you're getting a supplement. It's like taking vitamins. And in Sweden, they removed all that supplemental iron with pressure from these iron overload groups. They thought they were doing a great thing. It didn't make any difference on the ferritin in the population. And the food went up in price about 30% in Sweden, because all food had to be specially prepared just for Sweden. Okay, there are no iron-free diets. I mentioned this. You can decrease your iron absorption by drinking English tea. Some people like that. It's an easy thing to do if you like tea. PPI medicines, these are drugs that lower acid in your stomach. These will also decrease iron absorption, but not very much. There was a study this year from Holland that showed that if you take these medicines every day, you will reduce the number of phlebotomies by 1 phlebotomy per year. Now, you know, these medicines have had some unfavorable side effects associated with them, including cost. So I never recommend that to patients. I do mention the tea to them. We don't recommend that people take iron pills. Some people think that raw shellfish is bad. It's bad for anybody. Those things, raw shellfish is just full of microbes, you know, viruses and bacteria, parasites. These are things like oysters and stuff, raw. You shouldn't be eating that. Nobody should be. I want more treatment for hemochromatosis. I often think that my doctor wants no treatment for me. We hear this all the time, that the patient wants more phlebotomies, the doctor wants less phlebotomies. These are different tools for doing phlebotomy. You're familiar probably with phlebotomy. You may be familiar with this erythrocytophoresis. I'm not very familiar with it. This is a treatment that has been used in Germany, where it's kind of like dialysis. They have a machine that pumps blood out of you, like a motorized machine. It's got a loud pump, and then your blood goes through a filter. It kind of looks like a paper towel roll, and that removes iron, and then your blood is pumped back into you. So one of the potential side effects of these pheresis treatments is you can get an air bubble in the line and so on. So that's not good. And then I mentioned no treatment. I'm going to show you some slides about what happens to people who get no treatment, and you might be kind of startled by this. But this electrocytophoresis treatment was used by the Australian group last year to do the first randomized trial of phlebotomy. Now, why don't we have a randomized trial already of phlebotomy? It's because in the traditional treatment, the patient knows they got a phlebotomy and the doctor knows that you got a phlebotomy because they ordered it and they saw the blood coming out of your arm. So this could introduce a bias that would maybe influence the patient or the doctor into saying, oh yeah, you've got fatigue or you've got arthritis and so on. So in this study, the patients, these are all C282Y homozygotes, are randomized to have the erythrocytophoresis treatment, which is quite efficient at removing iron, or you can have what they call the sham treatment. It's the erythrocytophoresis machine pumping your blood, but they don't put the iron filter in the circuit. So the patient feels exactly the same. They see the motor and their blood going round and round, but they don't know whether they're getting treated or not. And then there's a treatment group, and then they compare them. So that's a classic scientific method to remove bias. So I was on the safety committee of the study, and I was invited down to Melbourne to review the study. And they invited patients to this open forum. And this woman got up, and she was a patient. She was also a physician. And she said, I never felt better than after I had those pheresis treatments. And then I discovered later that I was in the sham group, that I was getting the placebo treatment. So this is the whole dilemma of, the scientific method. And the other thing to remember is that phlebotomy has been felt to be energizing to everybody, not just hemochromatosis people. The ancient Chinese knew this. They did phlebotomy and bleeding for everything. And when we did our first studies at the Red Cross, I used to ask people why they were super donors. Some people donated hundreds of units of blood. And there are two answers. One answer is they wanted to help other people. That's good. But the other answer was because they felt so energized. And when you work in a clinic where everybody's tired, including all the doctors, and somebody's saying, that's just the most energizing treatment going, I mean, you notice. Okay, I mentioned it's an old treatment. So this is what they found in the Australian study. They had 35 endpoints that were predetermined. And this was the only one that was positive. Well, there was another metabolite found in the urine that was positive, but almost all the other endpoints were no difference between the two groups. And here we see that the people that had the iron filter and the iron removed had a 5% decrease in this iron score. This is a standardized score, goes up to 100, and your score goes from 25 to 20. Is that significant? I don't know. I don't use this score very often. It doesn't sound very significant to me, but maybe it is. But they were expecting a bigger effect, and they didn't get it. And in the AIR study, we did phlebotomy in the people we discovered over a 1-year period. And we did these quality of life measurements. It's called SF36. It's very standardized too. We did that before we started phlebotomy and when we finished phlebotomy. And we could show no difference whatsoever. So that was a bit worrisome, that we can't show any beneficial effects of the phlebotomy. Maybe we used the wrong methodology, but it was a very standardized tool. Now, this is another of the untreated groups. This was a study that I was involved with that had nothing to do with hemochromatosis. It was studying cholesterol, but they had stored blood. This was in Texas, and they did hemochromatosis genetic testing. And each curve represents a different pattern of hemochromatosis testing. So there's 6 patterns here, and the black line is the C282Y homozygote at the top there. And the higher the curve is up on the lines, the better the survival. So you can see here that the C282Y homozygotes, untreated, look like they have the best survival. It's actually not statistically different, but they certainly don't have a worse survival. And that's with no treatment. So that's kind of a disturbing finding. And this same thing was shown in this study from Copenhagen. Again, this is not a hemochromatosis study. This is the Copenhagen Heart Study. But they had stored blood and they did hemochromatosis genetic testing. And the black dots are male C282Y homozygotes. The open circles are female. This is ferritin. You can see it's 25-year follow-up. There's no treatment because these people didn't know they had hemochromatosis. So in the old days, we would have thought that ferritin would be going up and up and up like an escalator, and maybe damage would be being done. But here you see that a lot of these people are not going up. Some are going down, and there's a lot of flatliners. And, you know, some of them are elevated, say between 200 and 500, but not really highly elevated. So there it is. And then this is a topic I bring up sometimes in the clinic. And it's funny that patients don't want to hear this. And this is the story that hemochromatosis patients might have an enhanced survival, do better than the general population. Well, where does that idea come from? Well, geneticists have said this for years, that there has to be a survival advantage for this disease, which seems to be flourishing. When you think of many genetic diseases, like severe genetic diseases, the baby is, the embryo dies because you can't survive with a lethal genetic disease. So that's the worst type of genetic disease. There are other genetic diseases where you're born, but you're all shriveled up and you got bad organs and you don't breed, you can never have children, and the disease sort of peters out. Well, that's not hemochromatosis either. So they went on and with the genetic testing in France, they tested the French cycling team and showed that the hemochromatosis genes are overexpressed on the French cycling team and on the French Olympic team. So I like to ask people in the clinic what Olympic sport would be their sport if they were in the Olympics. You get a wide variety of answers. A lot of these people don't look like Olympians. So another thing they did is they went into nursing homes and they tested people over the age of 100. And they found that hemochromatosis genes were overexpressed in people over the age of 100. So how on earth did we end up studying a genetic disease when the people are living to be over 100 years old? So that's another phenomenon. But the patients who come to these sessions, like in Guelph, are mad and disgruntled and they've got disability forms and so on. So there's this sort of paradox going on here. Okay, so we're summing up here. You and your hemochromatosis doctors, how can you improve the situation? Try to find common ground. It sounds like, you know, a motherly statement, but it is often the way that things will get better. And if you find the right kind of family doctor, you can learn together, and you can bring them in something to read. They can give you something to read. You can say you went to this talk and you saw this and that, and you can grow together in the garden. You should outline your goals of treatment. And if you have some sort of radical ideas, like you want your ferritin to be 0, that's what one of the American blog groups was saying. I don't think there's even such a thing as a ferritin of 0. You better be prepared to prove why you think you should have that extreme kind of treatment. Try to practice evidence-based medicine. That's what doctors are always trained to do. They don't always do it. But bring that scientific methodology to your natural healers and shamans and so on as well, and see what happens. Be cautious about endorsing blog-based facts with no supporting evidence. Try to minimize your other risk factors for an elevated ferritin. Like if you're drinking beer every day, try laying off and seeing if it goes down, and it probably will. Realize that too much phlebotomy can be hazardous to your health. And if your doctor's out of touch with hemochromatosis, they should refer you to specialist care. And there's no reason why they shouldn't. Often it would be, the doctor will be relieved if they can make things happen that way.